In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who had been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. Calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may go and pay him homage also." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I want you to take a moment. Take a moment and imagine creation. I want you to picture the trees, the grass, the plants, and the flowers. I want you to see their colors and picture what they feel like and what they smell like. And I want you to picture the cycle of the seasons. What do these plants do whenever winter, spring, summer, and fall come? These patterns that of change. They always change, but yet it's always the same change. And the cycle of the seasons repeats itself year after year. And then I want you to move across to the Hardy Mountains and picture what the mountains look like through the seasons. And also picture the subtle change of erosion. Now let's move our eyes to the heavens. And I want you to look at the brightness of the sun and the clouds and watch how they move and watch how they change each day. And watch how they change when the weather changes. And watch for the patterns that emerge. And in spite of the fickleness of weather, the patterns remain the same. It follows the same pattern day after day, month after month, and year after year. Now let's take a look at the nighttime sky. I want you to look up and see the stars and see the familiar constellations like Orion or the Big Dipper. And watch how they move across the sky in the same patterns. And watch the moon as the moon moves across the sky in its own monthly patterns. And notice how these patterns don't change that much. Even the eclipses of the moon follow a pattern. And all of creation has a pattern, a method of moving throughout the years. Now, we got to do a little bit of time travel. Let's go back a couple of thousand years and take a look at the night sky without the lights of the cities, Try to filter out the moving satellites that are in space. Filter out the noises and the lights of the airplanes as they fly throughout the sky. I wonder how different that sky would look and how many different stars you would see. And just beyond, you see this group of men. They have their papers, they have their instruments of study, and they have a small candle that gives them just enough light to take a look at their papers. You watch them study the sky. You watch them make their marks. You watch them point and comment. And you realize that these men are what common people call magi, the studiers of stars, dreams, and creation. But then you notice there's a little bit of a difference in them. They become more animated, and they're vigorously pointing at something in the sky. And so you take a look, and you're trying to figure out what it is that they're pointing at. But since we're not necessarily experts of the stars and the patterns, we can't figure out what it is that they're looking at. And so for this moment, our journey is done in our mind's eye, but the journey of the Magi is just beginning. These men notice something different in the night sky. These men knew the patterns of the stars and the moon. They knew what these changing patterns meant. But this night was different because they saw a new star rise. And it wasn't something that they had seen before, nor was it something that they recall in their studies. And so they were puzzled. And like any good student of the stars, they took notes. They made their observations and they asked their questions. They were learned men after all, and they thirsted for knowledge. And tonight they had something new to figure out. And I'm certain that this new star gave them something to talk about. I can imagine that they went to their library to seek out their answers. They knew that this star meant something, but they just couldn't figure out what. So they start pulling down texts from the shelves. And they started pulling texts down from various languages and traditions. I mean, they pulled whatever they could find: Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, everything that they could find. And in the midst of all this knowledge and legends, an answer could not be found. I can imagine that they were just a little frustrated, that this answer was just beyond their reach. They knew that it meant something. They knew that there was a change coming, but where could that answer be found? And as their frustration grew, someone suggested they go to a small group of religious people, a diaspora of Judeans. They had heard that these people have their own religious text, and perhaps these people would be willing to share. And so the Judeans perhaps were willing to share with the Magi once they heard the story of the star. Maybe even willing to sell a copy. Or the Magi remembered that the Judeans had their sacred text and went to a scribe's place of work to get themselves a copy. Whatever the means, they had the Torah, and they had the prophets, and they began to read and study with all the enthusiasm of a child at Christmas. And as they pored over the Torah and going through the prophets, they see a theme emerge. A theme of a Messiah, a king. Someone who's supposed to bring peace and light to the world. Someone who would bring Jerusalem to the center of the world. Someone who would bring great change to the world. And so the Magi, they kind of put two and two together. This new star meant that a Messiah king had been born. And so they decided that they needed to meet this new king. And so they began to prepare for a journey, but not quite realizing that a journey had already begun within their hearts. They gathered their supplies. They gathered soldiers for protection. They had their servants prepare the animals and the tents. And they gathered gifts. It would be rude to welcome a new king without any gifts. So they packed the best: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, not realizing that these very gifts meant something completely different to the Messiah. But these wise men gave these gifts out of their own understanding of what kings need. I mean, what king wouldn't need gold to go and fund his army? What king wouldn't need gold to fund his palace? What king wouldn't need gold to fund his temple and his honor? Kings needed gold, especially the young ones. And then what king wouldn't want some frankincense? All temples used it in their religious ceremonies. If a king were to lead a nation, he needed to have the right incense to please the gods and the worshipers. And what king didn't need myrrh? Eventually, kings die and would need the best of the best to prepare their bodies for burial. These are appropriate gifts to give a king. So they set out for the city of Jerusalem, a journey west from where they were. It would be a long journey depending on where their starting point was. The starting point could have been the city of Nineveh, or perhaps further south down in Babylon. It could have been anywhere. But there is one path that all journeys take to get to Jerusalem. You have to follow the Fertile Crescent. You have to go in an arch because you can't cross through the desert like how Isaiah described. So it would be a very long journey indeed. I imagine this journey would be difficult, full of some uncertainties. Would they survive the bandits that would come looking for plunder? Would they survive the elements? What if the star went away and they could not find the new king? See, they weren't quite certain where the king would be born. They knew that the prophets talked a lot about Jerusalem, but they were kind of new to the understanding of the prophets. And so they took their best guess and went to Jerusalem with that new star driving them on. And after many days of travel, these magi arrived in Jerusalem. Instead of stopping at the temple to inquire about the new king and the new star, they decided to visit the current king. Wouldn't the current king know about the birth of a new king? It seemed logical. But this logic placed them in mortal danger, and it also placed the new king in mortal danger. In their quest, they neglected to glean information about the current political and religious climate of Jerusalem. They were just a bit unaware of how the current king, Herod the Great, was a ruthless man, a man who would kill his own family in order to keep his power and his throne. They were also unaware of the oppression that the people lived under Herod and the Roman Empire. But then again, the thirst for knowledge was something of great importance to these magi. I imagine if they had known the dangers, they would have continued to ask their question anyway. Where is the child who had been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage. I can imagine the anticipation as they waited for King Herod to bring them their answer. And I also can imagine a little bit of surprise on their faces whenever King Herod returned in secret with their answer. But no matter the means of how the information came to them, they had it. They just had to head south to a small town called Bethlehem, roughly 9 miles from Jerusalem. As they left the city gates of Jerusalem, one of them looked up to the heavens and saw the star, the very star that had began their journey. Then, as each one of them began to look up, they noticed the star was moving. It was moving south to Bethlehem. And their excitement bubbled forth. Creation was showing them the way. And they continued to follow the star until it led them to a house. When they were certain that the star no longer moved, they knocked and they entered. They saw the Christ child. They have found what they have been seeking all this time. Every moment of their journey brought them here. Every study of the Torah and the Hebrew prophets led them to this moment. Every discussion they had amongst themselves led them to here. Words could not express the emotions flowing through them. Words could not adequately describe their journey. Being left speechless, there's only one thing they could do: an action. The most important action that you can give to the Christ child. The action of bowing down and worshiping the Christ child whom the heavens itself declared his arrival. And then they continued their act of worship by giving their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These very gifts that would fund a refugee family and the poor. These very gifts that would represent the priestly action of the Messiah. These very gifts that would prepare the Messiah for a resurrection. Their journey was complete. They had the answer they sought to the question of the star, the very question that the star had given them. They paid homage to the Christ child, and they gave their gifts. Now they have to prepare for their journey home. They had every intention of returning to Jerusalem, following the same route that brought them to Bethlehem. They had also agreed to share with King Herod the location of the Christ child. But when one comes face to face before the living God, plans tend to change. They dreamed a warning. The danger they were in, the danger the Christ child was in, was realized. Being wise men, these magi, they decided to follow another route home to safety, as well as ensuring the safety of the Christ child's exact location. This journey of the Magi is one that we are all familiar with. It is a story we have heard over and over again. It is a story that causes us to wonder. It's a story that ignites a feeling of adventure. It's a story that is full of intrigue and danger. It is a story that allows the imagination to fill in the details that are left unsaid. It is also a story that is unfinished. Instead of taking a look at the action King Herod took in order to protect his power and throne, let's take a look at the unfinished story of the Magi. The gospel records they left on another route to home, But it does not share whether or not the Magi continue to journey spiritually with the Christ child. The gospel doesn't record whether or not these Magi were changed by their journey and the climax of finding the Christ child. The gospel doesn't record whether or not the Magi had shared with family and friends the story of the Christ child. You see, the gospel writer found other things that are a little bit more important. The first being that it was the outsiders, the Gentiles, who journeyed to the Christ child. That it was important for the gospel writer to show that at the very beginning, the Christ child is for everyone, for Jews and Greeks alike. What is important to the gospel writer is finding the Christ child involves a journey that can take you to places you didn't intend on going. It is a journey that begins in one way, but then it ends in a different way. The journey of seeking the Christ child involves change. What one does in response to the change is up to them. And this is the part that makes this story unfinished. We don't know the response of the Magi. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the Magi's story can't still relate to us, because it's a story of journeying. It's a story of seeking and finding the Christ child. And everyone who encounters the Christ child had to go on a journey first. So let's take a moment to look at our own journeys. What signs and wonders did you have that led you to the Christ child? What scripture inspired a change in you? What person or persons were instrumental in leading you to the Christ child? What does your journey look like? And who have you shared your journey to the Christ child with? But let's not stop the journey right here. The journey of the Magi is only the beginning of the story of Christ. The story of Christ that eventually journeyed to here, at this table. The journey that the Magi took is so similar to our own journey whenever we encountered the Christ child. The Magi worshiped Christ. The Magi gave gifts to Christ, and we do the same. And also, too, Christ takes a journey to this table. Christ journeyed to be in relationship with us, and it led us to here, to this table.